Well, hi everybody. So I'm working on another charcuterie board today. This is olive wood and it's got a pearl resin on it. So right now it looks pretty, but it's obviously imperfect. You can see where I had blocks and weights on the resin. So I'm going to go ahead and run this through the planer on both sides and then through the drum sander, and then I'll do the finished sanding. So stay tuned, you get to see the process. I'm using the router table to round over the edges of the charcuterie board, and then I fired up my sander with 80 grit paper to knock down the rough edges. Wouldn't it be great if in real life I could sand this quickly? Well, I've sanded this to 80 grit, and it's going to go up to 5,000 grit if you can imagine that. So it's going to be a glass-like finish on the resin. So I'm looking to make sure I don't have any voids. I've got my magnifying glasses on so I can see, and I do have a couple of minor things to infill. And this is important because as a charcuterie board, it's going to get food on it. You know, we don't want any crevices. So it's that little extra step. Let's see. So this is a special glue. It's called CA glue, and it's the woodworker's best friend. It only takes about 15 seconds for it to cure. So once it dries, I'm going to go ahead and sand that over, use high pressure air and spray it off, make sure that it's sealed properly, and then I'll continue with my sanding endeavors. Well, I'm at 180 grit now, and what I do is I come over to my lathe light. It's a really nice light, and I give it a real close inspection between every grit. I wipe it all down, and I make sure I don't have any crazy pigtails in the resin or any marks left in the wood. This is olive wood, by the way. And it's looking really good, so I'm going to move on to 220 grit next. Okay, well, I've sanded to 220 grit. This is my Festool sander. It's got a vacuum attachment, so it wicks away all that sawdust. But now I need to change to a different sandpaper. And this will be from 320 to 600. So this paper here is a mesh, and it allows for maximum airflow. So I'm sucking away all that sawdust. What I don't want is to be dragging that sawdust, any residue, on the resin, because it leaves pigtails, curlicues, and it digs into the resin pretty deeply, and then you have to go backwards in your grit, and it's a real pain. So this will be 320, 400, and 600 grit, and then we're going to start wet sanding. Well, we're moving right along. I've sanded to 600 grit. The olive wood has been sanded to 400 grit, and that's where I'm going to stop. Now, olive wood is just a beautiful wood. It's got tremendous grain, kind of goes every which way. I really like working with it. So now, to wet sand, I'm going to remove my vacuum hose. And I'm going to put on one of my wet sanding discs. This is 800 grit. I'm going to spray the resin and then sand it up. So I'm getting a nice paste. Tells me I'm getting up some of that resin. And what I do is I wipe it down in between each grit. You know, most people stop at 400 or 600 grit. The reason I go up to 5,000 grit, sometimes even 10,000 grit, is I want to create that magical piece. I like to set myself apart from other people, and that's one of the ways I do it. All right, so I'm going to flip this over and keep going, but next grid is 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and 5,000 grit. The fun starts at about 3,000 grit. That's when you really start seeing that glass-like finish, the colors pop, and you know that extra step is worth it to me. Well, the wet sanding is done, and as you can see, it's just gorgeous. So now I need to dry this wood before I can apply a finish. So I'll use a heat gun just on a very low setting and keep the heat away, and then I'll put it in front of the fan, and in a few hours it'll be dry enough for me to finish. This is gonna be beautiful. Well, it's time to apply the finish. This is Sawdust and Splinters Carnauba Wood Finish and Polish. It's become my go-to for applying a finish to these beautiful boards. So what I do is, with a clean cloth, I'll go ahead and just spread it around. All over the resin and the wood. And then what I'm going to do is use my buffing system, and it'll work its way, force the carnauba into the wood, and it'll really polish everything up, including the resin. So the buffer is a noisy proposition, so I'll show you what it looks like, and then I'll do that off air. So that's my buffer. Well, you're going to see the final product here in just a second. It's all done. Isn't that pretty? So you can see right through the resin, and you can see into the live edge of that wood, which I think is just a beautiful touch. Got a nice eye right there. The grain is fantastic. The finish really made it pop. So now you have an idea what the process is. There's about 5 hours of labor involved in all this. I appreciate you all tuning in.